Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. California Governor Gavin Newsom has survived the recall campaign against him in the recall election yesterday. 64% of the people voted against recalling and removing the governor from office compared to just 36% who supported it. Well, today we're going to be talking about the implications of this election, both for the state, but also nationally. And joining me for this conversation is Tim Redmond. Tim Redmond has been a political investigative reporter in San Francisco for 3 decades. He spent much of that time as executive editor of the Bay Guardian. He is now the founder and editor of the online news website called 48hills.org. He joins me over Zoom. Mr. Redmond, a very good morning to you, sir.
Thank you, and very happy to be on your show, Mitch.
It's great to chat with you. I'm not sure if we really have had a chance to catch up since the pandemic, which is my fault on that. But Tim, how are you reading the tea leaves when it comes to yesterday's election?
Okay, well, there's a couple of things. One is, Newsom won by 30 points, and the next gubernatorial election is in 14 months. I think this puts him in a very powerful position. I don't think it's going to be easy for example, a progressive to challenge him in a primary. I think he's basically made the statement that he has the popularity that he needs. And so I think it puts him in a very powerful position in terms of his future as governor of California.
That's interesting because a lot of people have talked about how this was going to scar the governor.
That is exactly what a lot of people thought. And just a few months ago, people thought, oh my God, he might barely escape with his political career intact. But that is not the case. It's gone the other way. I remember, because I'm very old, I remember when in 1983, there was an attempt to recall Mayor Dianne Feinstein in San Francisco. And people were saying the same thing. Oh my God, the mayor's she's never going to get over this. And people are really mad at her. And then, she raised millions of dollars and defeated the recall by about the same amount that Gavin Newsom did, or a little bit more, 70-30 maybe. And that was that. And people were talking about mounting a progressive challenge to her in 1983. And she won the recall so overwhelmingly that basically she didn't really face any serious challenges for the rest of her political career.
Wow, that's fast. What were they recalling her for? Who was bringing them?
Well, it was interesting. It was a weird thing. The recall was driven by a group called the White Panthers. That was a leftist group that loved guns, and they tried to recall her because she put a gun control. She approved a gun control measure, but at the same time, she had just vetoed the first domestic partners bill that Harry Britt had passed, and so the LGBT community was really mad at her, and so there were a lot of people who were mad at her. And so the recall got on the ballot, but she defeated it very, very handily by basically running against the White Panthers, who were, as I say, a weird left-wing group of gun nuts.
Not to be confused with the Gray Panthers.
Not to be confused with the Gray Panthers. Yeah, very weird group. Anyway, so Gavin Newsom, taking a chapter out of that, ran against Larry Elder. He didn't run so much against the recall as he ran against Larry Elder. Now, he tried early on, before Elder got in the race, he had tried to portray this as a Trumpian recall. It was harder to do, right? And, there was no indication that Donald Trump was involved in any of this. And then when Elder got in the race, it was very easy to say, look, here's the guy who could replace me. This is unacceptable in California. This is exactly what Donald Trump would do. This is exactly who he would support. And so, he basically, Larry Elder being in the race gave him the foil that he needed.
You mentioned this may very well thwart a progressive challenge to Gavin Newsom in next year's primaries, because Gavin Newsom is up for re-election next year, and we could sort of talk about the timing of this. But what was there momentum for a progressive candidate to challenge the governor next year?
There were certainly people talking about it, and there were certainly people saying, there's no candidate who'd come forward. No one has announced that they're running, and I think now nobody will.
Yeah. Is there Tim, this show airs across the country at community radio stations across the country. Is there dissatisfaction within the progressive community towards Governor Newsom?
Well, here's the thing about Gavin Newsom. He's always been a corporate Democrat. He's always been on the side of the real estate industry and big business and the tech industry. And there's always been dissatisfaction with him. There's a lot of folks who see Gavin Newsom as someone who makes a lot of progressive promises but doesn't carry through on them. For example, he ran for governor vowing single-payer healthcare. He said, we're going to have single-payer healthcare in California. The California Nurses Association strongly backed him because he was a supporter of single-payer healthcare. Do we have it? No.
Has it gotten to his desk?
What?
Has it gotten to its desk?
No, but in fact, he literally, the moment he was elected, he said, well, single-payer healthcare will happen, but that's going to be a long ways off.
Yeah.
Right. He ran as an environmentalist. It's only recently, well into his term, that he's even talked about banning fracking. Right. He has been, his housing bills, housing bills he's negotiated with the legislature have always protected landlords. Right. So there's a lot of people dissatisfied with him, but he's a Democrat in a Democratic state. And when people saw that Larry Elder was running and saying there should be no minimum wage, the minimum wage should be zero, and I don't really believe in mask or virus mandates, it was like, wow, well, we got to stop this guy. Plus, of course, there's huge national implications. If a Democrat lost California in a recall, that would be a strong message for the Republican Party that, well, Democrats can't even keep their act together in California, one of the bluest states in the country. Possibly more important is Senator Dianne Feinstein. And Senator Feinstein is, many people have said, is not in great health, and it is possible that she might not be able to finish her term. If that were to happen and there were to be a Republican governor of California to appoint her replacement, that would be the end of Biden's majority.
No, that's absolutely correct.
Right?
I don't want to.
The other thing, one more point on the national implications here, is that a lot of more moderate Republicans in California are looking at this and saying Trump is political poison. That the Trump effect, certainly in a state like California, is over. People really will vote against someone who is aligned with, or supposedly aligned with, Donald Trump or his positions, right? The problem is, in a lot of Republican primaries, you can't get elected unless you're a Trumpian. So this is going to set up some very interesting stuff for the midterms.
I don't want to get sidetracked here, but I do want to just say one thing about the push for single payer or universal healthcare in California. It's a fascinating story. One could write a book on it, I believe, and that the California state legislature, dominated by Democrats, has, during the years of Republican governorship of Arnold Schwarzenegger, continually passed a bill for universal health care that Schwarzenegger always had to veto. Once Jerry Brown became governor and the Democrats were back in the executive office, suddenly that bill never made it through the state legislature and has yet to make it through the state legislature.
Yes, exactly.
The Democrat as governor. Is there, what do you think the strategy here for Republicans were? Now, again, for people outside of the state, it's not that Gavin Newsom was running against a lot of people that no one ever really heard of. Larry Elder might be the most recognizable name, but most people had never even heard of Larry Elder before this recall election. He's a conservative radio talk host. You see him on Fox News a lot. But I think in California, he wasn't that well known outside of conservative circles. But it wasn't Gavin Newsom against Larry Elder. It wasn't Gavin Newsom against all the names that were on the ballot. The question was whether or not to recall Gavin Newsom. And that's what made it a little bit scary, because it was just one single question to keep Gavin Newsom in power or not. And if you had 50 plus one vote to recall him, then whoever got the most votes out of this huge list of candidates would have became governor. It's a strange system that we have. But was that the one Republican was that the one shot that Republicans had to get the governorship, considering that they don't seem likely to be able to get it any other way? Or do you think this was building for something in the future? Is this going to lead to something down the road?
I don't think so. I think that the demographics of California right now and the voter registration patterns, it's virtually impossible for a Republican to win statewide office in a general election, any statewide office. So this was the only way they could do it. The last time we had a Republican governor in California, it was Arnold Schwarzenegger, who became governor because of a recall. And you're right, Mitch, the recall thing is weird. It's like question number one, should we recall Gavin Newsom? Question number two, who should we replace him with? And then the one who gets the plurality of the replacement votes wins. And you could get elected governor of California with 20% of the vote. So it's a very weird system. And I think one of the things that's going to come out of this is reform of the recall. And that may be either making it harder to get a recall on the ballot, or it may be as simple as to say, if the governor is recalled, the lieutenant governor becomes governor. I mean, that's what would happen if Gavin Newsom left the office for any other reason, is the lieutenant governor would take over. So I think we're going to see a lot of talk about a constitutional amendment to change the way the recall works.
How difficult do you think it would be to get a constitutional amendment? Is it as difficult to amend the state constitution as it is the federal constitution?
No, it's actually, it's relatively simple. You just need both a majority vote in both houses and then a vote of the people. So it has to go on the ballot, but there are constitutional amendments that pass on the ballot all the time. And this one, I think right now would be very popular, because I think a lot of people are looking at this and saying, wait a minute, why did we just go through this? Why did we just spend $200 million on an election to recall someone who's going to be on the ballot again in 14 months anyway?
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Tim Redmond. Tim Redmond is the founder and editor. I keep saying editor. It's not in my notes, though, but I'm assuming you're the editor
Yes,
of 48 Hills.
That is correct, yes.
48hills.org. Tim Redmond is a veteran investigative journalist, and we are talking about the California recall election that happened just yesterday, in which Gavin Newsom overwhelmingly won a no vote towards removing him from office. Tim Redmond, you've been covering Gavin Newsom for a very long time, far before he was ever governor of the state or lieutenant governor of the state. You were covering him when he was a city council member in the city of San Francisco, and then, of course, mayor of San Francisco. You already indicated that this recall campaign probably thwarts any attempt from the left to try to run against him in next year's primaries. What do you think this means overall for Gavin Newsom's political standing?
Well, here's the interesting question, Mitch. When you look at where the money came, and he raised $70 million to fight this recall. And some of it was what you'd expect, real estate and tech money and so forth. But the largest, more than 10% of that, the single largest source of money to protect Gavin Newsom was labor, was organized labor, particularly healthcare workers. The TV ads that you saw and the YouTube and Facebook ads that you saw, I believe, are not what turned this election. What turned this election was the grassroots get out the vote effort, because everyone knew 6 months ago that if Democrats voted in large numbers, Newsom would be fine. The worry was what they called the enthusiasm gap. The worry was every Republican in the state was excited about getting rid of Gavin Newsom, and there was going to be high Republican turnout. And the Democrats were like, well, whatever. Half of them didn't even know there was a recall going on. And there's a lot of people who are progressive left Democrats who were not excited about Newsom, who were not excited about him when he got elected and are not excited about him now. And the idea that somehow those folks wouldn't bother to turn out, not that they would vote for the recall, but they wouldn't bother to turn out, was what scared everybody. So I'm going to argue that it was the grassroots party operations, Democratic Party operations. It was organized labor. It was the more progressive constituencies that did the GOTV and did the phone calls and did the texts and did the door-to-door that got Gavin Newsom, that helped Gavin Newsom defeat this recall. So now he's going to be governor, and it appears to me he's going to be governor for 5.5 years, unless something truly unusual happens. All right. So is he going to remember that the folks who put him in office are the folks who support single-payer healthcare, strong statewide rent control, progressive taxation, money for affordable housing? Is he going to shift his political center, as it were, to recognize that he would not be in office if not for for turning around disaffected people and saying, look, we got to protect Gavin Newsom. You may not love Gavin Newsom, but you got to keep him in office. Otherwise, we're going to have someone awful. The big developer money was behind yes on the recall. So going to say, hey, I'm still on the side of real estate and developers and big tech when they tried to recall me? Or is he going to say, you know what, I've got to start working on the priorities of the people who really kept me in office?
That's very interesting. Why was real estate? You said earlier, Gavin Newsom's a
I
corporate
know.
Democrat. Why would real estate oppose the governor in an election that would seem very unlikely they would win? Real
You know,
estate,
it's a
maybe.
difficult question. But you know, if you look at it, it's developers and the construction industry that really put it. And then there was, hospitality, hotels and restaurants. I can see that because they were mad about the shutdown, right? They were mad about the closure of restaurants and the fact that Gavin Newsom felt that even though no one else could go out to dinner, he could at the French Laundry, which was one of the biggest mistakes of his entire political career. For those of you who don't know the story, in the middle of the pandemic, when Gavin Newsom was ordering everyone in the state to shelter in place and not go out unless it was absolutely essential, he went out to dinner at one of the most expensive restaurants in the country with a bunch of Sacramento lobbyists, and no one was wearing masks. And a lot of people just felt like, this guy tells us we can't go out to dinner, and the restaurant industry is saying he's telling us we have to shut down and lay off all our employees, and yet he's going and doing it. So you can see where that is, but I don't see why. I mean, there was a period 6 months ago when it looked like Newsom might actually be in trouble, and that there might be a Republican governor. This might be a way for a Republican to sneak in to the top office in California, even if it was only for 14 months. But a lot can happen in 14 months, including a U.S. Senate appointment, and including appointments to the California Supreme Court, and including appointments to all kinds of other important offices. One could do a lot of damage in 14 months as the governor of California.
It seemed to me what the Republicans were missing this time, which they had in 2003, was a popular figure. In 2003, and I remember I was still a state legislative correspondent in the lead up to the recall. My last day was the day that they certified that the recall campaign vote would happen back in 2003 against Democrat Governor Gray Davis. And the feeling up to that point was, well, this isn't going to succeed. But then Arnold Schwarzenegger jumped into the race, and that seemed to upend that whole thing. And Gray Davis, I don't think was a very good governor, to be very honest with you.
And remember, that was in the middle of the energy crisis when there were rolling blackouts across the state, and no one knew whether their power was going to be on or not. And Gray Davis seemed to have absolutely no ability to do anything about it. At least in this case, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but the governor has taken action. And you and I may not agree on everything he did. I think actually, when it comes to the pandemic, he's done what a governor should do. He's trying to keep people safe in the state of California, and you can't say Gavin Newsom was missing in action on the COVID pandemic, whereas Gray Davis appeared to be missing in action on the energy crisis. Nevertheless, you had Arnold Schwarzenegger, a very popular movie star with virtually unlimited money of his own, but he was a big popular figure, and he was not perceived as a right-wing Republican. He was perceived as kind of a moderate Republican, and so that kind of star power and Gray Davis's apparent ineptness in the middle of a crisis created a different dynamic than I think we had this time around.
Yeah.
There was no Arnold Schwarzenegger on the ballot for the Republicans.
No, nor do they have Gary Coleman of Different Strokes, who was on the ballot. Ariana Huffington was on the ballot in 2003. Yep. It was really a bizarre election at that time. Speaking of real estate versus housing activists and Governor Newsom, we do have an eviction moratorium in the state that is expiring at the end of the month. Gavin Newsom had previously indicated he's not likely to extend it. Is that a sign of what would be to come?
Well, that's one of the things that's the question. Is he now, after the recall and after the politics of the recall, going to once again side with real estate and say, we're not going to extend the eviction moratorium? This would be catastrophic in many parts of California. It would be catastrophic. I mean, San Francisco has its own eviction moratorium, and other cities may follow through, but the state of California as a whole, if there's if landlords are allowed to evict people for non-payment of rent, we are not out of this yet. There are many, many, many tenants who are 6, 8, 10, 12 months behind on the rent, right? And the federal rent subsidies that are supposed to help out with that have not reached California. The bureaucracy getting that money is very difficult. Much of that money has not reached California at all. And many landlords, I suspect, don't want to wait for it. In fact, many landlords in cities where there's rent control may be thrilled to get rid of a rent controlled tenant so that they can bring in somebody who can pay higher amounts of rent. Right? So we're talking about tens of thousands of people losing their homes, many of them having no place else to go. So if he doesn't extend the eviction moratorium, that will be a sign that he really didn't get the message from the recall, that he didn't get it.
Is it something you think is being reconsidered now? I didn't think it was very likely that we were going to extend the eviction moratorium until the state of New York extended its eviction moratorium. And I thought, well, maybe that would play a role here. Maybe we would reconsider. Or is this? I haven't seen a lot of coverage about this very issue, and it is expiring now in 2 weeks.
Yeah, it is. And I think Newsom could very easily extend it for a month or two. Give the state legislature more time to come up with a more long-term solution to the back rent crisis. Give tenants who owe back rent an opportunity to actually get the federal money that's out there. And it's going to have to be put in the context of more statewide tenant protections in general. I mean, even if there's federal rent relief money, it's not going to cover all of everybody's back rent. It's just not enough to do that. It's not going to cover all of the back rent that everybody owes in the state of California. So we're going to have to come up with some kind of solution here that involves landlords accepting less than 100% of the back rent and not being able to evict people if we, for example, if we were to say, okay, if the tenant is willing to pay half the back rent, you can't evict them, right? And this should be part of a larger campaign for statewide rent control and eviction protections.
Tim Redmond.
We'll see. I can see, this state legislature, when you look at powerful interests in Sacramento, the three of the most powerful interests in Sacramento are oil and gas, real estate, and big telecom. Right. And this as having been a legislative correspondent, it's very hard to get statewide tenant protections passed through this legislature, even though it's controlled by Democrats. That would be a different story if the governor was a leader on these issues. And if the governor came forward and said to the centrist Democrats, we're going to have statewide rent control and I'm going to campaign for it, it would be easier for that to happen, as opposed to the governor just basically sitting there and saying, well, send me a bill and, I'll look at it.
My last question probably should have been my first question, but this is the reality. We are already now 25 minutes into this conversation. And that is, was this recall, can it be seen as a referendum on the governor's handling of the pandemic?
It certainly was in part. Because the Republicans, and certainly Larry Elder, wanted to say, their argument was, we should not have mask mandates. We should not have shut down the entire state. We should not have vaccine mandates. And this kind of libertarian thing. And I think Californians overwhelmingly rejected that. Californians overwhelmingly said, no, we need to follow the science and take action, painful as it is, during this global pandemic to keep it from being worse in California.
Should this be seen as a sign to continue doing such actions?
Oh, I think the voters have made it very clear that that's what they want to see. Yeah.
Tim Redmond has been our guest. Again, Tim Redmond is the founder and editor of 48 Hills, which is a San Francisco news website. You can find it online at 48hills.org. He has joined us to talk about the California recall election. Tim Redmond, thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.